So his style was never going to be a Vern Gagne. And from the start, he was really more of a roughneck wrestler. For the first 5 years of his wrestling career, he got trained in '57, and by 1962, he had started to finally start wrestling full time. But in the beginning, he was a good guy. And by a good guy, we mean the babyface. And for some reason, he just wasn't going over. You know, the fans really, I mean, he was on the card. And they played the angles up really good. That by 1963, Larry had taken a trip, and this is true now, as far as, when I say it's true, I'm telling you because in wrestling, there's a lot of things they tell you that aren't true. No kidding. Guy said to me the other day, this is off the cuff. Guy said to me the other day, he says, I thought Mad Dog Vachon was always from Canada. I said, no. All right. So Larry went down to Texas, and he was working in the Fritz von Erich territory. And he started to be a little more rougher in the ring and decided he liked being the bad guy. So when he come back here, he was a little bit bigger. He put on some weight. And they did the smartest thing they could. The idea is that Larry was getting bitter at not being able to get big matches. He was angry that Vern Gagne was the champion, and he graduated from Robbinsdale too. And, you know, he's better than his trainer. You know, I could beat the old man. They started to play this up already in 1962. So it became a natural feud, the two Robbinsdale boys, and having this feud. Can the pupil win over the trainer? And it worked perfectly for about the next 15 years. They had many different showdowns in various matches, and Larry just became more of a brute. Well, by 1964, he became, instead of just plain Larry Hennig, or Big Red Hennig, as he was referred to, he hooked up with Harley Race, as we talked about one other time, and Harley Race was handsome Harley Race. You know, we had the bodies of Hercules, the minds of Einstein, and the faces of the goddess of love, and the fans hated Harley Race as handsome. Well, he became Pretty Boy Larry Hennig, and Larry would just stand out there and just, you know, they're going to build a monument. We're the greatest tag team in the world. Well, they were sensational, and they still had their feud with Vern Gagne, etc. So Larry made a lot of money as a brute, an angry wrestler. Now, before you ask the question, how was he outside the ring? I could feel it coming. Okay, so I'll make something up here. No, I will not. I will not. Outside the ring, as most of the wrestlers were, many of the bad guys were, Larry was a very, very humble, quiet man who was very, very family-oriented. And if Larry had one problem, it was that he legitimately hated Vern Gagne outside the ring. They did not like each other. And Larry's problem is that I really believe, and this is an opinion on this part, but I really believe that Larry was jealous of Vern, because Vern owned the company, and Vern was Robbinsdale first, and he was second. But the reality of it is that Larry was so good that some of you may remember I said in the United States in the 60s, we had 25 territories around the United States. Plus they could go to Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, which wasn't a state yet before 1960. And they could wrestle all over. And Larry could have went anywhere he wanted, and he would have been on top of the card. But Larry's problem was, and this is a good problem, because I admire him for this, he didn't want to leave his family. He had a wife, he had kids, and Larry, with the travel of wrestling, he didn't want to be on the road for 2 months. So he chose to stay here. And I think that also made him a little bitter because it was a sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice he wanted because he wanted to be with his wife and kids. So the bottom line is Larry was a good man. And the only thing I'm going to tell you outside the ring is, after many years, some of you may know, some of you may not, my fun in wrestling has been compiling results records of all these wrestlers. I like to go back and study all their cards, all their matches, whether they won, whether they lost. And we know it's predetermined, but the fun part is that you get to see when they're a good guy, you get to see when they're a bad guy, you get to see when they're at the bottom of the card, you get to see when they're at the top of the card, and it just tells the story of their career, and that's why I do it. Well, I had put together Larry Hennig's career wrestling record as best I could get it. And I will say that no career record is ever complete, because just when you think you got them all, oh my God, there's 3 matches down there in Amarillo. This was Christmas morning. Okay, I found them. But I bound it together, had it spiral bound, and I had a chance to visit Larry Hennick's house in St. Cloud back in 2012. And Larry, his wife made us sandwiches. We were talking. I actually was talking to Larry about doing a book. I wanted to do a Larry Hennick book. And Larry wasn't ready to just sit down and make the commitment. But he had my book there, my wrestling results book. And I asked him, I said, well, Larry, would you sign a copy for me? And I had one of my own, and I had one I gave to him. I said, would you sign it for me? Well, here was the greatest thing. This is heartwarming at the point. Irene, his wife, walked behind me. She went over to about where the wall is there to their coffee table, and she comes back, and she puts down in front of me my Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling book. And I'm like, wow. And sticking out of it, there's the sales slip from Barnes & Noble. They went out and bought the book. And Irene said, we'd like to have you sign your book. Now, do you know how special? I mean, seriously, Larry Hennig wants my autograph. You know, I can write, Larry, but I'll prove it to you. And I told Irene, I said, I would have given you a copy of the book. She says, no. And Larry looked at me and he said, all the good things that you've done for wrestling and all the many nice things you've said about me and this record, he said, it's an honor that we bought your book. Thank you. You know, I felt like I had just died. I was looking at God. And so we had our sandwich and we talked. But that's Larry Hennig outside the ring. And the only final thing I'm going to say is, flash forward to 2017. I got to spend a whole day with Larry Hennig sitting right next to him. The city of Robbinsdale had created, they were doing a celebration at one of the breweries, and they created a special beer for this day, and it was called The Axe is Back. Now, I want to clarify that in 1974, Larry Hennig again became a good guy. And he was no longer Pretty Boy. He had put on some weight. He had a big red beard. And he was now Larry the Axe Hennig. And the axe was his elbow going into the person as they come off the ropes, knocks them out, you know. And but he was the Axe. Well, they came out with this beer, the Axe is Back beer. It was limited edition. They wanted Larry, his whole family was there, and a lot of people to celebrate this beer. They wanted Larry to come up and talk, and Larry said to me, as I'm sitting next to him, he said, will you go up and do the introduction and talk about me? He says, you know more about me than I know about you. And he said, then when you're done, I want to talk about my family. And that's what I mean about his family. So I went up, introduced Larry the Axe Hennig, all about his wrestling career, and I said, and now friends, I'm really happy to bring up my friend Larry the Axe Hennig, and of course we had the accolades. And then Larry went on, and for, 20, 30 minutes, he talked about his beautiful wife Irene, his kids, and he named them one by one. And one of his funniest stories is he says, I have 26 grandchildren, and he says, I'll be damned if I can remember the names, so I give them numbers. Number 26, come here, wait, I want 13, send him over here. And I thought that was hilarious. So we get done at that event all day long, and we go home. And this was on a Saturday. The following Monday morning, my phone rang. It was Larry Hennig. He says, I just wanted to thank you for Saturday. I said, oh my God, Larry, not a problem. I said, man, I love you, and thank you. We talked for about 20 minutes, and I get off the phone and I went back out to Lorraine. I said, that was Larry Hennig thanking me. I mean, those little things, I'm not going to lie to you. They're just special feelings, because these are heroes that I had growing up, and a lot of times your heroes aren't really the people that they try to be. So I said, that was Larry on the phone. Well, ironically, later that same week, Larry passed away. I got the news, and I told Lorraine, I said, he actually was calling me to say goodbye. He had some serious liver problems and stuff at the time. So you can see I get a little bit emotional about that. But Larry, I feel that was my last chance to talk with him, and I like that memory. So outside the ring, just one of the nicest guys in the world. His feud with Vern Gagne, the highlight of the matches with Vern Gagne was that they were going to have a loop. You remember back in the 70s when the streaking was going on? Yeah. Ray Stevens, the singer, not the wrestler. Ray Stevens, the singer, had the streak. Well, Larry Hennig, not to be outdone, he said, if I can't beat that bald-headed, spindly-legged former world champion, I'll streak down Hennepin Avenue. Oh my God, that drew the fans. Well, Larry did streak, but he had a flesh-colored bodysuit on. But it did make the papers. So anything to sell tickets. And I haven't told that story till right now. So. Any questions more about Larry Pretty Boy Hennig, one of the nicest guys in the world? Any? All right. Oh boy. Yep. Oh boy. Wrestling played on fans' emotions for many, many years. And up in Canada, there was a wrestler named Guy LaRose, L-A-R-O-S-E. They pronounced it LaRose. And Guy LaRose, he was wrestling quite a few years, and he was another one of those guys who was in the middle of the card. He'd make some mid-card money, wasn't really going anywhere. Promoters weren't really using him. You know, they'd have somebody else beat him up and win. And here we are after World War II. And, you know, we were at war in World War II with Japan and Germany. Well, Guy LaRose, he come up with this beautiful idea. I'm going to shave my head, and I'm going to become a German. And I'm going to call myself Hans Schmidt. And this was Hans Schmidt, and when he'd come into the ring, they'd introduce him from Munich, Germany, at 265 pounds, Hans Schmidt. And he'd stand there and he'd goose step across the ring, you know. And he had his hand up. He didn't have a claw type thing, he had his hand up. And of course, he was the enemy. And here's what I meant about the emotions. After World War II, and we've mentioned this before when we're talking about how to get the fans in, wrestling made real good use of the fact that, and it wouldn't be politically correct today, nor should it have been back then, but anybody that was a foreigner was a bad guy. And of course, being that we were at war with Germany, you know, from the end of 1946 he wrestled through the 70s, or mid-70s. And he was automatically the villain, the German. He was going to take the title, you know, he was going to win the title here and go to Germany and never come back. And oh my gosh, you know, we're never going to have him defend the title. And he beat up opponents, and he slugged and kicked and pounded in the ring. So he was really, really good. Outside the ring, again, one of your very, very nice, very calm guy, very low talker, and just very well respected. And I will tell you that legitimately, Vern Gagne, you know, again, wrestling was, they took care of each other in the ring. And Vern Gagne said, and he said it more than once, he said, my toughest opponent was Hans Schmidt. He said, the guy just didn't know how to pull a punch. And he said, I had more bruises and more bumps when I get done wrestling against Hans Schmidt. But there again, you had Mom's apple pie good guy Vern Gagne against this hated German who wanted to take over America. And he was in the AWA in the 60s very early, and then he'd come back periodically throughout about 1973. Any questions? I never asked for questions before. I wanted to get them before you asked.
Yeah. I was ready.
You have one?
Oh, no.
Okay. All right. So that's Hans Schmidt, and just really one of the first German heels. And it went over really well. And the promoters could play on our emotions because it was America, USA, you know, and back in those days that was. You know, this guy looks like he's going to go eat up a city. This is, as it says, the Crusher. And I want you to know that, you know, many of you probably remember the Crusher when he was a baby face. This was probably one of the best pictures. And Crusher as a heel, as a fan, this is my opinion, but he was so much better as a heel than he was a baby face. And especially in the later years when he became more cartoonish because of his age and his inability to really do a lot of things because he was getting older in the ring. But as a heel, I will tell you, this guy, you talk about hated. He came in the ring and you guys are all familiar with the full Nelson. You know, you put it on the guy's neck and you put the pressure down. Well, the Crusher used to use the full Nelson on his opponents, and he would have their heads so far down they were practically licked in their belly button. I mean, he just putting the pressure on, and of course the opponent sold it. Well, the referee, the wrestler would pass out. That was part of the program. You know, he passed out. My God, let up. And Crusher wouldn't let go because he said he couldn't. His fingers swelled up, and he couldn't pull them apart. So the referee's counting to 100, you know. And the Crusher, he's just, and he literally said his fingers swelled up. And as a heel, he'd do this look when he'd have that hold on, and you know, on TV, and he's got this look. I mean, he's maniacal. And like I said, he looks like he could just take out a whole city. So that was one of his things as a heel. And he kicked, he stopped, there was nothing scientific. And the other hold that he used was, he called it, and by the way, he didn't call it a full Nelson, he called it the Crusher Nelson, okay? But he also had the stomach claw. And he'd have his opponent down, and he'd sink his fingers into the guy's stomach. And you know, when I got pictures of this too, you see it, his fingers are like, you know, they're embedded. And he'd go in there, and the wrestler would be, you know, can't get out, he can't move. The Crusher is just keep, and you know, like, the guy gave up, he passed out, Crusher let go. And he'd come out and say he couldn't do it because his fingers swelled. His fingers, he had a swelling problem. So as a heel, the Crusher was really, really good. And from 1962, when he came back, he had been here in the 50s briefly as Reggie Lisowski, his own real name. But when he adopted the Crusher name, he really took over. And Vern, we talked about Crusher Kowalski earlier, Vern recognized the right thing. This guy was drawing some serious money. And so let's have a battle of the Crushers, let's really push him. And all the baby faces, he was a maniac. I do want to tell you just a quick story about this picture, because I just shared it with my wife a couple weeks ago when we went to the state fair. This particular picture, I don't know if you guys know where the beer garden is in the state fair. Right before the midway, there's a beer area or lounge area. Well, back in 1962, I don't know, what am I, 11 years old, 12 years old. I was there with my dad, and up behind the counter of the bar, there was an 8x10 picture, this picture. The only picture up there among the other whatever novelties they had. And I pointed out, I said, Dad, I said, look at, you know. Well, the owner, the guy running the table or the bar, come over, and I told him, I said, you got the Crusher up there, you know, I'm in awe. A little while later, we'd finished our food, and the guy came over, and he gave me the picture.
Oh, wow.
True story. And I still have that picture, and that is my story about the Crusher, that I got that picture. And he didn't have to give it to me, but he did tell me, he says, you're the only one ever noticed it. Well, my lucky day, you know.
Did he bring the keg of beer?
Yeah.
Is he the one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Crusher as a bad guy, I'll touch on that in a second. The Crusher as a bad guy, he just was pure evil. I mean, this look, and he had the crew cut in those days, and no matter who the good guy was. And of course, Vern Gagne became his main fodder, you know, get rid of that. And again, Vern was always considered old, even though they were about the same age. But he definitely was the best heel we had. It was inevitable that eventually, and I'm not going to go long into the story because we talked about this one other time, but in 1965, or 64, Vern and Crusher had a series of matches in a program, and they decided that the territory wasn't big enough for both of them, and it was going to be a loser leave the AWA. Well, we know Vern wasn't leaving. I mean, we didn't know that at the time, but Vern owned the joint, so I don't think he was leaving. So Crusher left town. Truth of the matter is that anytime Crusher left town or when he was injured, they would say the Crusher's injured. Usually it was a self-imposed vacation. He liked to take time off. And it used to drive Vern nuts because they'd all of a sudden, Crusher said, I'm not going to wrestle for 2 months. Vern, I need you here, you know, come on. Crusher would take 2 months off. So, you know, fans, Crusher's back has been injured by so-and-so. That's the way it was with Crusher. Well, they lost a loser leave to AWA in 64 in the summer. And then by the end of the year, the Crusher and the Bruiser happened to be tag team champions. His cousin, they were cousins like Steve and I are.
Never claimed that.
Yeah. So anyway, they were bad guys. And what happened is eventually by a year later, when Vern Gagne was having trouble with Larry Hennig and Harley Race, he needed to get a partner. He's got to get somebody that fights like they do. They're brutal, they're beaten, and they've beaten other opponents. I need a partner. So he surprises everybody with the Crusher. Oh my God, can you trust the Crusher? They hate each other. They just ran each other out of town. It was a great storyline. And so they became a team. And from then out, the Crusher was the #1 baby face here. And as a baby face, he always bragged about carrying kegs of beer when he was 13 years old up the hill for his old man in Milwaukee. And he'd have the beer barrel that he'd have on his shoulder. And he said, I go up the hill and I tell my old man that I got beat up by a kid down below, and the old man would say, well, did you win? No. Well, then get back down there and go at it again. You know, the Crusher had all the stories. But really one of the best baby faces and best draws ever in the business. And anytime Vern needed to boost attendance, he would find a way to lure the Crusher. He'd come back for a while. And usually it was, he'd say, Crusher, I need you to come in and win the tag team title, you know, or do something. And Crusher would always have a stipulation. Well, I'll do it, but we're going to only go a couple months. And he had that, and he had Vern by the proverbial, what you want to call it. There you go. So, great draw, great heel, and as a baby face, he was funny as hell. He came out and he played the Jack in the Box. Dun, 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 dun. Well, Pop Goes the Weasel. Well, the Pop Goes the Weasel was for Bobby Heenan. He wanted a Pop Goes the Weasel, driving Bobby Heenan nuts. He had all kinds of antics. When he became a good guy, he had a feud with Mad Dog Vachon, who we're going to talk about. But he had a feud with Mad Dog. And he'd come out to the ring. Remember I told you what he did to Killer Kowalski with vegetables? Well, he'd come out to the ring with Mad Dog when he was in the ring, and he'd have a bag of dog food, and he'd be throwing dog food at the dog, and the dog would be slipping and sliding on the dog food, you know. So it was all about the entertainment. And the Crusher and the dog, we'll talk about that when we get to the dog, but they probably have the longest running feud in the AWA. They actually had several cage matches, and that's just the way it was. The Crusher was very popular.
The Crusher.
Can you describe his voice?
Can I describe his voice?
Crusher's voice.
I can't describe his voice.
Yeah, that was it.
The Crusher, he was always talking about his dollies. When he was a bad guy, he was talking about parading in the bar with the dollies. And I don't like these little women. I like these big, fat, 300-pounders, Marty. You know, I want to have something to put my arms around, you know. And one time he won the world title, and he had the world title belt on. Well, he said, this belt by Gagne, it's pretty cheap. He said, I had my Milwaukee beer. My belt maker made me a belt, so he also had a belt on with 2 beer bottles on it. You know. The Crusher always had antics. He had names for everybody. He called Bobby Heenan the Weasel. He called Blackjack Lanza. I don't know if you guys remember Mighty Mouse cartoons. Yeah. Mighty Mouse's main adversary in those cute little cartoons was a guy named Oil Can Harry. And he always had Sweet Sue on the railroad track, you know, with the train gonna run over. Oil Can Harry. Well, that's what Crusher originally called Blackjack Lanza, that Oil Can Harry. He used to just always antics. He used to call Mad Dog Pussycat Vachon, and that, of course, when you're just a character.
The Algerian lapdog. He used to call him that too.
Now, I want to tell you now, again, before he asked me the question, how was he outside the ring, okay? I never knew Crusher. Crusher actually was, and not because I should have known him, he was just one of the wrestlers I didn't. I only had a chance to talk with him in 2000 very briefly, a few years before he passed away. But the Crusher, for the most part in pro wrestling, was really a guy that kept to himself. He didn't mingle a lot with the fans. As a bad guy, of course he didn't, but as a good guy, he didn't either. He wasn't always a guy you could approach to get an autograph. He was more withdrawn, and it was just his nature. And again, we talked about Larry Hennig being a good family man. The Crusher, from all accounts, I've heard stories that he was very committed to his marriage. His wife, Faye, I think they were married like 60 years. And his kids, pretty much very quiet. But he wasn't much of a fan person. A lot of people will tell you it just was just not able to get up close and personal to him. So that was my story.
Was his voice an affectation that wasn't the way he normally sounded?
He actually did have more of the gravelly voice. Yeah, I mean, he had adopted that when he became a heel and pretty much used it. So,
Harley Ray said that when Crusher was the best there was on the stick, nobody could sell tickets like he could.
well, that's the thing, and that's why Vern needed it at
Coming from
times.
Harley, that's kind of
Yeah.
a big compliment.
Yeah.
And he used to mash the cigars. He'd have a cigar in his
Oh, yeah,
face.
he'd get mad, he'd have a cigar,
Yeah.
and he'd smash the cigar, and he'd have those bulge eyes, you know. and He was gonna have a cage match one time with Mad Dog, and he had tomatoes in his hand, and they had a cage up there, and he was squeezing the tomatoes into the cage. This is gonna be Mad Dog Vachon's face, you know, so.
He had a song too, right?
Pardon?
He had a song, he recorded it.
Well, he didn't record it. In 1964, after he had left the Twin Cities in that loser leave match, there was a Twin Cities rock band called the Novas. They were one of the garage bands that were famous in the 60s. And they came out with a song called, appropriately, The Crusher. And you can look it up on YouTube. That'll give you a homework assignment. Just look up the Novas, The Crusher song.
It's funny.
And the song starts out, I think they go, whoa, do the Crusher, you know, something like that. But it was played on KDWB and WDGY back in the day. He thought he had me on that. Okay. Mitsu Arakawa. Mitsu Arakawa. Remember I told you about the Japanese at war? Mitsu Arakawa was one of those first Japanese wrestlers and he really was from Tokyo, Japan. And in 1953, actually it was 51 when he started the gimmick of being this evil Japanese wrestler. But it worked so well because, again, we went to war with Japan, if you remember, in World War II, and the Japanese automatically were our hated rivals, much longer than they probably should have, because now, of course, we're friendly with them, and we should be. But there you go. He was, every time he'd come to the ring, it was more money. And him and Crusher had a great feud, and when the Crusher was a good guy, and the Crusher hated him so much. In fact, one of the pictures I have with the claw hold was the Crusher doing it to him. But the Crusher said he's going to send him back to Japan, and I brought my own transportation, and he had a garbage can, the old metal gold or silver garbage cans. And lo and behold, that night at the matches, he stuffed Mitsu in it to the fans cheering. He was going to send him back to Wakachuki Wookie or whatever he'd call it. You know, he always, how do you say that word, Marty? You know, he'd say. So, but Mitsu was just your legitimate Japanese wrestler, and he used to do, to anger the fans, he'd come into the ring, and they always had to do the Japanese ritual when they were introduced. And I can't do it like they did, but it basically was a thing where the Japanese wrestler would do like a stomp this way, and then they'd go and do the other way. And to the fans, they were just stalling and wasting time. And then they'd take out their little packet of salt that they had, and they'd throw it over their shoulder, for supposedly good luck. But it was always amazing because that doggone salt, somehow, the referee never took it, and eventually the poor opponent got it thrown in his eye. And he's blinded, and the referee's looking, and Mitsu, it's gone. You're like, good job. So, he was a great heel, made a lot of money, and Vern had a nice feud with him, and always a good draw when he was on the card. And it definitely was that rivalry and that playing on the fans' emotions.
Did you ever wear the Japanese flag kind of symbol?
Mitsu never did. He never came in with any flags or anything. Some of the Japanese wrestlers after that did, where they'd be waving the Japanese flag or something. But Mitsu pretty much, he would come into the ring sometimes wearing what they called the kimono or whatever it was. He'd have that with but usually this is how you appeared. It was almost like and he'd always have that look like he's kind of sneaky. And in the ring, when the referee wasn't looking, he'd kind of come around. He knew he was gonna, as they would say, Pearl Harbor the opponent. So they actually said that on TV. So, but just a great heel. I do not know him outside the ring. I never had that opportunity. And really, by the time, probably around 75 and on, he had been gone from here for a long, long time. I do have a chance today, as we speak, where I know his son Eric on Facebook. And we have talked, and I've shared some things with him, and he's shared some things with me. So, and Eric's a good guy. So I'm going to guess that Mitsu was too. Okay? We gotta get going, you know, they hush you out of here. No, they don't. We'll stay tuned. All righty. Oh, boy. Oh, boy. This, kids, is as great as it gets. I'm telling you. Mad Dog Vachon. This picture is from 1964. And he started his career in 1949 wrestling as plain Maurice Vachon. And he was from Canada. And he was another one of those guys that really wasn't going that far up the cards. Believe it or not, I wish I should have brought a picture. The beard, and he's got a little bit of hair there. Later on, his head was shaved. He'd lost the top, and then he just shaved the sides. But he used to have a full head of hair. I mean, you could comb it back. And he used to have no beard, and you'd never recognize him. Like, it's two different people. But Maurice Vachon, and he was mid-card, not doing well. Well, he went into Portland, Oregon, which was known as the Pacific Northwest Territory, and it was Salem and Portland and Eugene, Oregon, and Washington State, and Vancouver was in this loop. And the promoter there, Don Owen, he brought in Maurice Vachon. And for whatever reason, Mad Dog told this story later privately. He said he just got fed up with, you know, he wasn't getting the top matches. He was always in the third match on the card or the second match. And so he went in this particular night on TV, and he just decided he was going to start clubbing his opponent. And he scratched his back with his fingernails, you know, and he was just going around the ring. And he was Maurice Vachon. Well, Don Owen, who was the promoter doing ringside commentary, he actually made the comment, he said, I don't know what happened to Maurice Vachon tonight, but he's in there clawing and gouging like a mad dog. And that's where the name came from. So Don Owen had actually unintentionally, anybody that's ever told the story has said it wasn't planned, which is unusual about wrestling, because usually they plan everything. But they said it wasn't, but Mad Dog became a heel. And that's when he was no longer from Canada. He was from Algeria. And the story went, you know, with it, and again, I wish I could imitate their voices, because he had the growly, snarling voice. But, you know, and that pose there, you know, kind of and half the time he had teeth missing.
Yep.
But, you know, that growly look, this is the way he'd come out on the interview and to the ring. And he would say, you know, he grew up in Algeria starving, and we had to eat out of the garbage cans, and I'm never going to starve again, and I'm going to beat all the American wrestlers, and especially Vern Gagne. Well, here was the unique part. Vern Gagne was always the target. Well, because he was the champion most of the time in that time period. But the thing with Mad Dog was Vern and Mad Dog outside the ring were really good friends. Mad Dog had represented Canada in those 1948 Olympics that I mentioned. Vern was for the United States. And Mad Dog had wrestled in the Olympics in 48, got into the business, and Vern and him had kept in contact. And when Vern took over the AWA territory in 1960, it was inevitable that eventually he would bring in Maurice Vachon. And especially when he adopted that Mad Dog persona. And Mad Dog was probably I want to say he was the greatest bad guy we ever had. He was just so believable, and he was little. The guy was he was a little, like built like a fire hydrant, probably 5'6" at the most, and you saw the way he looked, and he just came to the ring, and he was so aggressive. He was poking them in the eyes, and he'd take their mouth and yank them around the ring, you know, punch them and kick them, and, you know, everything he did, and it was so believable because he was a mad dog. And his feud with Vern went on for so long. It was money wherever they wrestled, and Vern loved him. And but what happens in wrestling eventually, as Mad Dog got older, at the gate, and this was at the box office, the same as it was with the Crusher, their name on the marquee could sell tickets. Yeah. They based on their reputation. But as he got older into the later 70s, he wasn't able to do a lot of the things in the ring, the aggressiveness that he had, because he had slowed down. The guy was, in his approaching 50 at that time period. And so Vern Gagne was having trouble with Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. They had injured Vern's partner. And Vern says, I don't know what to do with these two guys. In order to beat them, I got to come up with somebody who can wrestle like they do or fight like they do. And he left it at that. And they teased like this for a couple weeks. And then he comes out and he says, I found a partner that could take care of Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson. And he comes out with the dog. And he'd come out with that kind of look, Oh my God, Vern and the dog in the same ring. This was going to be 3 guys against 1. Well, Vern and the dog became a team. And he was a babyface, of course, because he was with Vern. But he wrestled the same way. Just, mean gouging. Now we have the bad guy. Actually, we'd have 2 bad guys in the ring whenever he wrestled. And Mad Dog was really, really just the ultimate heel. Now, he's not here, and I'm going to beat him to it. He went out. How was he outside the ring? Mad Dog was probably everything the Crusher teased that he was. He was a pussycat. He was a teddy bear outside the ring. Very low talker, very low key. And I am going to share one of my special moments with him. A couple times, aside from that first, a couple of times over his career, Mad Dog, he lived in Omaha, Nebraska when he worked for Vern. And he'd do the traveling from his home in Omaha. And a couple times over the years, I'd get a manila envelope, and inside would be a picture of Mad Dog Vachon, one of the 8x10 glossies, and he'd sign it for me. And he'd send it to me. And it was just a favor. He'd just do it. So that meant a lot. But I was at the Waterloo Wrestling Hall of Fame, and I was with a group of people there, and I had my book. We were all selling books. And across from me was Mad Dog Vachon and his wife, and Mad Dog was selling pictures. And his wife comes over across the room, and she comes over and whispers to me, she says, Mad Dog wants to buy one of your books. I looked over and I said, tell him I'll come over there in a little bit. So I went over to the table and I said, Mad Dog, you're not going to buy my book from me. Because again, he had done things for me and been nice. And I said, I will give you a book. Are you sure? I'll buy it. I said, no. I said, you keep the money. Buy dog food or something. But I gave him a copy of my book. And the one other time I had never met his brother Butcher, Paul Vachon. And Butcher, they were real brothers. That's one of the few times in wrestling where they were real brothers. I didn't know Paul. And I had walked up at this, remember the Taste of Minnesotas they used to do in front of the Capitol back many years ago? Well, lo and behold, the Vachon brothers had a booth there. I had never talked or met Butcher. And I had Mad Dog's autograph all over the place, and I had pictures with him. And I had some pictures of Butcher and Mad Dog together, and I wanted to get Butcher to sign them. I didn't know Butcher at all. I came up to the booth they were in, and I said, hi, Mad Dog. Oh. And I said, I want to get Paul's autograph. And Paul was busy with somebody else. I said, I want to get your brother's autograph. He said, just a minute. You give him autograph. You do anything he wants for you. Paul. So again, that's one of those special things when you know how they are outside the ring. Mad Dog was always very, very nice. And Mad Dog, unfortunately, after his wrestling days, he used to jog in Omaha. In the mornings, he'd go jogging. And in the early 80s, he had actually it was later 80s, 87-ish. He was jogging on the side of the road early in the morning, and he got hit by a car, and it was a hit and run. The driver left him. Mad Dog had rolled into one of the trenches, and he laid there for several hours, and when he was found, his leg was pretty smashed up, and he ended up having to have his right leg amputated. And that was a tough thing for Mad Dog, because for those of you that remember Mad Dog, one of his famous ring entrances, whenever Marty O'Neill or even Gene Okerlund, when they would introduce Mad Dog, he would jump around the ring. And I always felt bad when he lost his leg. I thought, that's just the Mad Dog. And I watched him walk up a set of stairs one time when he had his what do you call them, the
Prosthesis.
prosthetic? He had that on and I watched him, and I mean, that was, but you know, he never became bitter from it. He was more of an advocate for wanting to, you know, have safe driving and that sort of thing. But one of the funniest moments was, you guys may remember that Baron von Raschke was a partner of Mad Dog in the 70s as a heel team. And on one of the TV shows, they were guests after their wrestling days. And we're gonna talk about the Baron later, but Mad Dog came out, and of course he's got the phony leg. And he used to always end his interviews with the famous saying, "It's a dog-eat-dog world." Okay? Well, he said that, and just as he did, Baron von Raschke came up behind with his claw and he says, "And that's all the people need to know." And then they said, "Baron, what are you doing here?" He said, "I'm here to have a three-legged race with Mad Dog." And the final thing with Mad Dog, later at the very end of his career, he was in a feud with Jerry Blackwell, who he called Jerry Fatwell. And the world wasn't big enough for the two of them. And
No.
you look at it on YouTube, it's out there. There's Mad Dog was building a casket, a wooden casket, and he's pounding at it. He's got his shirt off and he's got an apprentice apron on, and he's pounding. And lo and behold, it's weird. Just by coincidence, Gene Okerlund happened to walk in with a microphone. "Mad Dog, what are you doing here?" "What are you doing? How'd you find me?" "Well, what are you doing, Mad Dog?" And he's pounding. He says, "Building a coffin for Jerry Fatwell. It's not big enough. One of us has to go out, you know." And that was their feud. That was his final feud. And then, like I say, a couple of years later, he lost his leg and stuff. But a character, and outside the ring, really one of the nicest guys in the whole wide world. Okay. Question. You didn't get a chance to ask the question how he was, because
And I was worried when I went to the bathroom.
I was going to say, those potty breaks will kill you.
I know, I was worried.
All right, here we go. Superstar Billy Graham. Oh man, I want to tell you something. When he came here in first of all, let's start about who he was. He was Wayne Coleman, real name. And he had also played for the Canadian Football League, and kind of a football player, but he got into wrestling, and he took the name Superstar Billy Graham. And his reasoning was, first of all, he wanted to be superstar because at the time when he took the name, you will remember the Jesus Christ Superstar movie, play, everything that was out. So that was part of it. And then he wanted a name because he claimed that he was a wrestling evangelist. He was going to spread the good word. So he had to be Billy Graham. And I'm really surprised that the real Billy Graham never really moaned about it. But it never happened. But the other side of it is that he came in as he was the younger brother of the famous Graham brothers, Eddie, Dr. Jerry, and Crazy Lou Graham, of which, by the way, none of them were brothers. But they wrestled as brothers. But he came in, he was the first one with this build. I mean, this was really, if you looked at Gene Kaniski, who we looked at earlier, and Hans Schmidt, you know, these guys didn't have real muscle. They were bigger than most guys, but they weren't muscle. Well, here was Superstar with the psychedelic trunks, as he'd call them. He took a lot of his interview shtick from Muhammad Ali. And I can't do it like Muhammad Ali did, but he would say that he stung like a bee or something, and you know, whatever. And he would come up with the craziest lines, you know, take a look at these biceps, Marty, but he had some of the greatest lines. He said that he'd tell Marty O'Neill in the ring, he'd say, "You're looking at the reflection of perfection, the #1 selection, Daddy." You know, and he says, "You've seen the rest, I'm the best." And he just was over, huge as a villain, a heel. The arrogance. He was the first one that he'd tell the referee right in the middle of the match, just a minute, and he'd get down there and he'd be posing, you know, counting. The referee would be counting. But he was basically, he got he couldn't wrestle much. He wasn't really an accomplished wrestler, but he was the gimmick wrestler, where he could draw with his look and his charisma, his interview. And he just really one of the best on the microphone, drew a lot of money for Vern in the early 60s. Later on, he went out east. He actually became their world champion out in the World Wrestling Federation for a while. And just a good guy. Outside the ring, he was a dink. He wasn't a nice guy. I was at Cauliflower Alley with a lot of people, and a lot of times the wrestlers would come in and they would sign autographs for you and for fans and other people, and you had a book, they'd sign it, you had a program, they'd sign it, and they weren't charging for it or anything in those days. Well, here was Superstar Graham at the back table, and he wouldn't sign any pictures for anybody unless they paid him. Now, this is going back 20, 25 years, okay? And he wouldn't sign any pictures unless you paid him. And if you wanted to have a picture with him or have him sign a picture, he wanted more money. And Nick Bockwinkel, who was the president of the Cauliflower Alley Club, he actually went up to Superstar and he said, enough. We do not do that here, and you don't charge. And Superstar got ticked off, packed up his table, and left. And he just wasn't he wasn't fan friendly. And the bottom line about the wrestlers, I think you have to realize, is that any of them that are nice to the fans and talk with the fans, they realize that it was the fans that put food on their tables and made their livings. So Superstar wasn't a nice person. He had a lot of issues. Sadly, he was the first wrestler, this build, I really hate to tell you, but this wasn't all natural. He was the first one in the early 70s who admitted to using steroids. And he was the first wrestler, most of the wrestlers said that he was like the first one that started kind of sharing or encouraging the steroids. You want to get bigger, you want to look bigger, get the look, and he was one of the first ones. And ironically, a lot of people did take his advice, but Superstar had a bad ending the last few years. He ended up having to have a liver transplant. Literally, his body, his kidneys, everything shut down. A lot of it, they contributed to steroid abuse and chemical abuse. He had some cancer, so he had a rough time his final years. But his contribution to wrestling, I mean, it can't be overlooked. He was a draw. And if you had him on your card, any promoter, you want somebody that's going to draw money for you. And Superstar was that guy. So, any questions? And I don't want to say any more about him because I'm going to bring him up again, but I want to leave it at that.
How tall was he?
Pardon?
How tall?
Superstar, I would say, well, they used to tell me I was 6'1", until I went to the doctor last year and she said, you're 5'11". I said, what the hell's happening? But he was a legit 6 foot, 6'1"-ish. And I never knew that, I never noticed that he had any elevated or, boots or anything. So I think it was probably legit, about maybe 6 foot. Okay? All right, he may get brought up again with a story that oil can Harry. This is a very unique story. We had mentioned earlier about Vern Gagne training Larry Hennig. Most of you know that Vern Gagne trained many wrestlers over the years for the pro ranks. Vern loved the amateur wrestlers and he encouraged them to come into the business. He'd train them to the professional side. In other words, how to work a match that looked real but wasn't. And all of Vern's students, with but the rarest exception, made huge money in their business throughout the years in territories. In the early 60s, a guy named John Lonzo, L-O-N-Z-O, Lonzo, he was a school teacher in Minneapolis. And he came to Vern, and Vern wanted to be trained for wrestling. And Vern trained him. John Lonzo didn't sound right to him, so Vern says, we're going to call you Jack Lanza. And for some reason in those days, in those early years, Jack Lanza would come in the ring. He had a full head of nice brown hair, and he'd come in the ring wearing a red robe. A lot of times the babyface wrestlers would wear a robe to the ring with a white towel around their neck, kind of like what the boxers do. And Lanza would come in with the white robe, and I don't know why, but Vern thought he needed an Italian on the card, so he claimed that Jack Lanza was from Italy and he was the Italian champion. You know, little known John Alonzo from Minneapolis. Well, he didn't have the mustache or anything in those days. But the key thing was that Jack Lanza didn't really have a lot of charisma, character. So about 1964, 65, all of a sudden we're introduced to, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, 253 pounds, fans Cowboy Jack Lanza. And he's got cut-off jeans with a horseshoe on the back and a white cowboy hat. And now he's a cowboy from Albuquerque. And you know, I think most of the people, longtime fans, probably knew the difference. But believe it or not, there were fans that maybe didn't watch for a while and never remembered that Italian guy. So he was Cowboy Jack Lanza. Ironically though, Cowboy Jack wasn't really going very far either. He still wasn't, just lacking that interview charisma. So he was in Indianapolis, and Bobby Heenan came up to him one night. They'd struck up a friendship, and Bobby Heenan told him, you know, you ought to turn heel. The only way you make money is to be the bad guy. So they had Jack Lanza turn on his tag team partner in a match shortly after, and his partner was Rene Goulet, who was a babyface in those days. Jack Lanza turned on him and started kicking and stomping, and lo and behold, there was Bobby Heenan all of a sudden. It's 2 against 1. And he was no longer Jack Lanza, he was Black Jack Lanza. And he'd grown the mustache, and if you look at him, you know, it's a pretty good look. And he made a lot of money throughout the years as Black Jack Lanza. And he was no longer, though, as Blackjack. He was now from Laredo, Texas, wasn't it Laredo? Yeah, Laredo, Texas. Blackjack Lanza. The guy traveled. But he went full circle. He wrestled a lot of territories, made a lot of money in all the territories as Blackjack. And at the very end of his career in St. Paul, he had a feud with Bobby Heenan here. And he broke up with Bobby. He'd gotten tired of Bobby interfering in his matches. Well, it was natural that, you know, they're going to have to get even with one another. And one of Lorraine's very famous moments, nobody knew this. He used to come to the ring with a black hat. He had a black vest, black trunks, high black cowboy boots. And he had the black trunks with the white horseshoe on. Well, this night when he's finally going to get a revenge on Bobby Heenan, he came out with a white hat, white vest, white trunks, white boots, and he had the white glove on. And it was like, oh my God. And Lorraine says, he's white Jack Lanza. But Bobby Heenan had a fit, and it was just a great answer. And he finished his career as a good guy. Later on, he went to the WWF after his wrestling career ended. And he was one of the behind-the-scenes guys in the locker room. You know, going on the road with the wrestlers is kind of, what do they call them?
Road agent.
Road agents, thank you. Something I didn't know. I knew it, I couldn't think of it. The road agent, so he finished us the career. And sadly, Jack left us about 3 years ago. He passed away. It was in the paper. Lo and behold, it was John Alonzo of Minneapolis, former school teacher. He was a great guy. And there's the weasel. There's the weasel. And I'm going to tell you right now, if there was a heel that was the best at what he could do, Bobby the Brain Heenan. And he said he had a brain. He used to be called Pretty Boy Bobby Heenan. And then he said, I have a brain, so you're going to call me Bobby the Brain Heenan. He was a menace to the Crusher. He was a nemesis to the Crusher. He was a nemesis to Vern Gagne, to Greg Gagne, Jim Brunzell. You name it, everybody hated. And his Crusher gave him the weasel thing. Don't call me weasel. And he would come out in his interviews and he'd say, I'm sick and tired of being called a weasel, and I don't want to see those weasel posters anymore. Well, the fans didn't know he was the one selling them at the table. Selling weasel posters to show, you know, to irritate him. He'd get mad. He had matches where he was going to be stuffed into a weasel suit if he lost, you know. And one of the greatest moments, he had a match with Greg Gagne. The loser had to put on the weasel suit. Well, of course he lost. And they come out with a white furry weasel suit, big paws on it, a big long white tail, big old puffy feet, a zipper up the front, and the hood, and he wasn't going to get into it. Well, Greg got behind him, put the sleeper hold on him, and put him to sleep, and they stuffed him in the suit. And then Greg wakes him up with a slap, and he's sitting there kicking and stomping and falling down. And, you know, it was all for the entertainment, the weasel suit. But any wrestler, and this is truth, everything about Bobby Heenan, every wrestler I've ever asked, or any wrestler you hear talk about, if you ask them who was the best in the business, it was Bobby Heenan. And he wasn't a wrestler, but he did wrestle. But he wasn't a wrestler. But he could draw the fans in, and as Bobby said, I could get my ass kicked every night of the week, and they'd come back again tomorrow to see it happen again. You know? So Bobby was just the best there was. And one of my favorites, and I may have shared this, but he was Nick Bockwinkel, who he managed. He was in a feud with, Nick Bockwinkel was in a feud with Vern to try and get the title back. And Bobby says to Gene Okerlund, he says, there's no way that he can beat, Vern Gagne can beat him and beat Nick. And he says, Bobby's got an issue of the Wrestling News magazine, and it's opened up. So you see the magazine opened up front and back cover to the audience. And he says, I want to tell you, we got to hold Gene. I want you to tell me what Vern Gagne is going to do with this secret hold. And of course, Gene played it up. Oh my, Bobby. Well, here it was a picture that he didn't know about, that it was a picture, it was the centerfold of a Playboy model. And Gene Okerlund said, I did not know that was coming. And then he threw the magazine down when he walked up, but he had put a centerfold in there. So Bobby was always unpredictable and very good. He was funny. And you remember Nick Bockwinkel used to be so articulate and smooth talking. When Nick talked, you had to have the dictionary there looking up words because he was using these words nobody ever heard of. In fact, he really did that. He went to dictionaries to look up words he could use. That's a fact. But he'd have the words there. And one time he asked, I'm probably going to mess that one up. He asked Bobby Heenan something about a paradox. What's a paradox? And then Bobby brushed it off and he didn't know. And the next day, Nick had said to him, he says, you know what time it is right now in Guam? And Bobby looked at him, he says, I'm still trying to figure out what a paradox is. You know, they had this unique relationship. But he was very well loved. And sadly, outside the ring, Bobby Heenan was pretty nice too. Very nice guy, actually. And one time when I got to play a heel manager, I mentioned that to you briefly, I was going to interfere in the match for the guy that was wrestling that I was managing. And Bobby Heenan was in the audience that night, and he had come up to the ring, and he had pretended he was handing me something, you know, the foreign object. And I took it, and I'm hanging on to it. He went back. They asked him what he did, and Bobby said, it's none of your business. I gave him a tip on the Vikings. But the deal was that I was supposed to hand this to my guy in the ring, and I did. And, you know, that's another story. But after the match, Bobby Heenan said to me, he said, you did pretty good out there. He says, but just be careful. You know, watch yourself. And I was not going to be a manager, and I was not going to be in the ring, you know, but that was Bobby. He was pretty good. He met a sad demise. He loved to chew tobacco, and he was a heavy smoker all of his life. And he got throat cancer, and it was horrible. His last few years, he had to have his jaw removed. You see how he looks here. If I showed you a picture of Bobby in his last year, he had lost his ability to talk, the great talker that he was. And he had lost his ability to talk, and he had all these surgeries, and he was, it's so sad. And he passed away. So, just a great guy. We'll move on. And there's the man himself, Wicked Nick Bockwinkel. Perhaps the greatest, I want to say the greatest babyface heel there ever was. Because Nick could really wrestle, and he showed it in his matches, but he cheated, and the fans thought that, you know, why doesn't he just wrestle? But he was the greatest talker. Vern trusted him explicitly with his world title for 6 years. Put the world title on him. Vern gave it to him. And when I say gave it, he won it in a ring from Vern, but he wouldn't do that with everybody. He trusted Nick to carry the torch. And he could trust Nick, and Nick always did whatever Vern wanted. If you want me to lose it, I'll lose it. If you whatever you want me to do. and just one of the greatest guys in the business. And my greatest joy is with Nick is that I became friends with him, and I value that friendship. And Lorraine knows he would call often, just talk. And in the later years, he got Alzheimer's. So some of the final calls were painful. But we got Christmas cards from him every year. And he invited me to his 60th birthday party in 1994. He had a big birthday party at the Mendota Heights Country Club in Inver Grove. And I got invited among a few wrestlers that were there, and Lorraine and I, of course, got invited. And Nick said to me, and it's always meant a lot, I told him, I said, Nick, I'm the only guy that's not a wrestler here. He says, you earned the right to be here. So that's a thank you. His final talk I had with him, he had called me 3 times at a Christmas time. He left a message on our voice recorder back when we still had a landline. And it was a few days before Christmas. He said, Georgie, Nicholas Bach here, just calling to wish the Shires Merry Christmas. We came home, we listened to the message. Well, the next afternoon I got a call. I picked up the phone, I got a call from him. He said, Georgie, it's Nicholas Bach. Just wanted to call and wish you Merry Christmas. This was in his Alzheimer's, and he didn't remember. And I talked with him for a while, and we'd talk for 20 minutes, but 10 minutes we'd have the same conversation over again. But I loved it. And then we got to Christmas Day morning, and our family was over, and we're getting ready for Christmas, and the phone rang, and it was Nick. Just called to wish the Shires a Merry Christmas, and I talked with him for a few minutes, and when I got off the phone, Lorraine said, who's that? Who was that? I said, it's Nick. I said, he called again. Well, it wasn't long after that we got the word that, on a Sunday morning, I got the word that he had passed away, and I will admit I had a tear in my eye. Back in 2017, that he had passed away. So he was just an excellent guy outside the ring, very personable, and in the ring, one of the best talkers, but a great heel. He knew how to do it. So, okay. Here is, by all accounts, they always said Bobby Heenan was the best in the ring. The other guy that they will always tell you that no matter what, you want to name a wrestler that could do it all, it was Ray the Crippler Stevens. And Ray Stevens started out, believe it or not, he started wrestling at age 16 at a gym in Ohio by a guy named Al Haft, who had a gym, and he'd have kids come in and wrestlers. And Ray he dropped out of school. He wanted to be a wrestler, and he was just a tough kid. He wasn't the biggest guy in the world, but he had that snarl on his interviews. When he'd talk, he just hated him. And he'd come in there, and, I hate Larry Hennig, I hate his wife, I hate his kids, I hate his dog, I hope his dog bites him. He'd have just things like that, and he'd be like, this guy's off the rails. In the ring, Ray was so spot on. Any wrestler, if you ask them, they will say, who was the best wrestler that you wanted to be in with or you could depend on? Ray was the guy. Everything was timed so perfectly, how he knew what to do at the right moment, the right move, the right flip over the rope. And he was so good at it. And the irony of that is that Ray was the most party-going guy you ever saw in your life. He couldn't wait to get out, have the beers, smoked heavy, drank all the time, up all night long. He wouldn't get any sleep. Come to the ring, he may have been drunk half the time, but you never knew it. He was so good. And Nick Bachman, who worked with him a lot over the years, he said, Ray was phenomenal. He said, anything that we could do, Ray could do better. And he said he was just that good. He was so spot on. Outside the ring, Ray was a fairly nice guy. I never got to know him personally, but I do know the day that he passed away in 1996, I had gotten a call. I was working at the bank, and I got a call from Nick at the bank, and he says, I just wanted to tell you that Ray passed away. I said, I'm sorry, Nick. And Ray was only 61. So this would have been 1996. And I said, I'm sorry to hear that. Got it. And Nick, actually, you could tell he was choked up. He said he lived life to the fullest. He said he partied every day, so he had a good time. So that was Ray Stevens. But he got over by being the bad guy, and none were better. I know there's somebody sitting here right now who really likes this guy.
I do.
Actually, and this one is signed to me, best wishes. But Baron von Raschke, a Vern Gagne trainee, 1966. Jim Raschke, as he says, Jim Raschke from Nebraska. He was from Omaha, but he was an Olympic wrestler, and he wanted to get into wrestling. He contacted Joe Dusick, who was the promoter in Omaha, and Dusick said, call Vern Gagne in Minneapolis. And Jim Raschke called Vern, and I want to tell you, and I mean this with no insult intended, Jim Raschke as a babyface and a new wrestler in the ring was the most boring, the most clumsy, the most awkward looking guy you ever saw in the ring. He just looked awkward, clumsy. And he wrestled as a good guy for about a year, and there was a guy on the TV studio each week named Mad Dog Vachon, who would, when Jim Raschke would wrestle or be behind the scenes, this went on for a few weeks, and both of them told this story, and I've heard other wrestlers tell it, so I want to take it as fact. Mad Dog peeked in a couple times and said, "You look like a German." And he did this a few weeks. And then, "You should be a German." Well, finally one week, Jim Raschke says, "I am German." Well, Mad Dog this was in 1967 now, and Mad Dog was going to be going up to Montreal, Canada to wrestle, where he wrestled a lot. And he asked Jim Raschke to come with him. And Mad Dog gave him the Baron von Raschke gimmick, taught him the goose step. And you see that he's got is that a swastika?
No.
That's the cross, the iron cross. The swastika is different. Yeah, but even that, when he would come to the ring with the red cape and the iron cross on it, and he adopted the German accent so far. The only fun part about it is his name was Raschke, which is German, and Baron said, "We're going to call you Baron von Pumpkin." And he was serious. And Mad Dog said no, or Baron said, no, I am a German. I got a name, Raschke. Will be von Raschke. It was von Raschke. And he adopted the claw. Well, how he got the claw hold was really funny. He had to have a finishing hold as an evil German. And he wrestled a good guy, Pat O'Connor, and I think I mentioned this once before, but he was in the ring with Pat O'Connor trying to be this German wrestler, and Pat O'Connor whispered to him, he says, "Put the claw on me." And Baron went, "What's the claw?" Put your hand on my head, and pretend you're squeezing. Okay, so that's how it started. It was in the ring, they worked it out. What's the claw? And Baron was just outside the ring, you can remember his interviews, "Das ist richtig, that's all the people need to know," and he had that gruffy voice. But Jim Raschke, sometimes you'd have to sit there, excuse me, what did you say? And I had the honor to do an interview with him one time at his house when he lived up in Lake George. He had a novelty shop called the Wigwam. And it had all this junk you buy when you're on a road trip, this junk you bring home, you got to bring a souvenir, and then you put it in the drawer, and then next week it's in the garage sale. Well, he had all this stuff, and he had a sign right across the top: "If I have it, you don't need it." But Mad Dog, or Baron, I did an interview with him for a magazine, and we were sitting at his kitchen table, and he had two stories that were just cute. He wrestled on he brought up cards that he was on, and I said, "Well, Baron," I said, "you were on some cards when the midget wrestlers were on." And I said, "What did you think of the midgets?" And he goes, "Very little." And in those days, folks, they were midget wrestlers. That's what they called them. Today, I'm sure that's not politically correct anymore, but they were the midgets. Anyway, that was his comment. And then he said, I said, "Well, Baron," and of course I knew this asking him, but we wanted to get his stuff on the tape recorder. I had an old tape recorder at the time that I was using, and I wanted to get his version of it. I said, "Well, Baron, when you went into St. Louis, I said, you were not the Baron. You were just von Raschke." He goes, and he's doing it in his Jim Raschke voice. He says, "Well, yeah, I got demoted." He said, Sam Muchnick, the promoter, he said, "I couldn't be a Baron because that could be intended that I might be better than a champion or the world champion. So he didn't want a Baron. So I had to be just von Raschke." And he said, "So I got demoted." And it's cute the way he said it, But he was Baron von Raschke. Later on, as he got older, again, one of those guys that could still draw on the marquee based on the reputation. He was so hated as a villain. And he had a great feud with a guy we're going to talk about it at the end, so I'll share that later. But he eventually morphed into a good guy, and he was cheered by the fans at the end of his career. And today he lives down in Hastings.
Yep.
Yeah, I just told him.
Yep.
You just told him. He lives down in Hastings. He moved, him and his wife Bonnie, who he always very casually called Mrs. Claw. But he lives with Bonnie. They've been married 1,000,000 years. And he is just a nice guy. Lorraine has met him. He's always very kind to her. And I had him at our house one time, and my daughter Amy had went to Germany and taken German in high school. And so when he was at the house, I said, dude, I want you to do me a favor. I said, I'm going to call my daughter and I want you to talk German to her. So he did from my phone and got Amy on the phone. And he did that. And Amy just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. I said, well, I don't know what the hell he said to you, but you know. Anyway, she thought it was cool. Yes, sir.
I met him at Kenny J's memorial service.
And I was there last year at Kenny J's thing.
And I had him put the claw on me.
That's what happened to you. Look at you.
But the other thing is, you might mention about Bertha.
Who?
Bertha.
Oh yeah, well that's at the end of his career.
Yep.
He was having trouble with Jimmy Garvin, gorgeous Jimmy Garvin, and he decided he was going to come in as a tag team partner, a silent partner for the Crusher. Jimmy Garvin had his manageress, Precious, a lady manager, and she was evil. But Crusher was going to have his own lady manager, and here comes Big Bertha. And it was Baron with a wig. And nobody knew, of course.
And he did country club commercials.
Yes.
He had the wig on and a dress for country club
The
market.
Baron is just literally a nice guy.
Yep.
And you can have a talk with him anytime you want.
He's
We gotta go
87.
on.
I think he's 87 years old.
He did, he is. He just had a birthday in July. Yep, 87. A couple of years older than you.
Yeah.
You told me how old you were.
Yeah, and you listen.
Here we go. This is Ivan Koloff, the Russian Bear. And again, in the late 60s and very early 70s, you know, remember I told you the ethnic stuff they pulled off. And Koloff was the evil Russian. I always found that interesting because usually the Russians were bad guys, but you know, in World War II, if you guys know the history, they really were an ally to the United States at the time. So they really weren't our enemy, but in America, they were the bad guys. Well, he was terrible. He is just evil from Russia. He was going to take the title back, the world title back to Mother Russia, you know. And he ended up starting in the business about the mid-60s. And at first he wrestled as, strangely enough, an Irishman, as Red McNulty. And he had an eye patch on, and he was Red McNulty. But so he was Irish. He had went into the WWF, which is later today's WWE, long before. And he was the hated Russian. He wrestled against Bruno Sammartino a few times. And Bruno really liked Koloff as an opponent. I mean, they got along, they formed a friendship. But little did they know that any fan at the time that, okay, now I said he was Irish, he was playing a Russian, but in actuality, he was a Frenchman named Oriel Paris from Canada. And when Bruno lost his title, at his request, he wanted to lose it to Ivan Koloff. He wanted to do the favor to Ivan. And he became the champion out in the East Coast. But Vern Gagne brought him in, and the main thing with Vern was Vern did something kind of unique. He was never going to admit that, you know, he brought him in as the guy that beat the legendary Bruno Sammartino. Vern actually acknowledged that, the legendary Bruno. But the problem is that Vern was never going to let him beat him, because that would mean that, you know, Bruno was better than him, and so on and so forth. So Koloff got a good push here. He had a long tag team with superstar Billy Graham. And he was managed by Stan Crusher Kowalski while he was wrestling here. And Stan was both wrestling at the time and doing a lot more managing, because he was a little bit later in his career too. So that's the story about Ivan, but just a great gimmick how they worked it. And later on, he became, I think at the end of his career, he kind of became a semi-good guy too when things cooled off. Angelo King Kong Mosca. And he was a Canadian football player, played for the Hamilton Tiger Cats.
Yep.
Does that sound right?
Yep.
Tiger Cats. And he was a professional football player, got into wrestling after football, actually during off season, and then got into wrestling full time. He was just a brute. He had that look that he has. He was just kind of very deliberate in the ring. He pounded his opponents. He had a feud. He called himself Angelo King Kong Mosca. Well, he ended up in a program against Larry the Axe Hennig. And Hennig, he would irritate him. He says, I'm going to get in the ring with Monkey Man Ping Pong Mosca. And King Kong would come out. He says, the man's insane. It's King Kong, not ping pong. Simple little things that I guess irritated the fans. And one of the funniest moments in the world, and I only bring this up because I know Lorraine loves this. He's got a manager, Lord Alfred Hayes, and their tag team partner was one of the mass super destroyers, which we're not going to talk about. But they're going to be in a tag team match, and Hayes is doing the talking, and there's King Kong Mosca with a comb, and he's combing the hair out. While true story, right? It's just hilarious. He never said anything. He's just combing the hair. And look at the guy. You can mow it for God's sakes. Okay? So that was King Kong Mosca. Okay? Well, we've got another King Kong. Now this is ironic. A couple years later, King Kong Mosca left the territory, and believe it or not, Frank Goodish, he came into wrestling. He was dubbed as Bruiser Brody by Vince McMahon Sr. out on the East Coast, and this guy was huge. He was a monster. Well, when he came into the AWA, Vern wouldn't call him Bruiser Brody. Truthful, out of respect to Dick the Bruiser, who was a regular here, and Vern, in fact, they were partners in Chicago promotion-wise, Bruiser and Vern. So he had to become King Kong Brody. Ironically, King Kong Mosca never existed after that. This was the only King Kong Brody. He was the guy that he was extremely hard to work with in the ring. Most opponents would tell you that he was going to do things his way, and you had to work with him, and he was a great draw. Any promoter wanted him on their cards. But he was his way or the highway. And so sometimes you had to swallow it and say, all right, I'm going to put you on the card. But he was tough to work with. And if he didn't like it, he'd walk off. He was in a match with Mad Dog Vachon, when Mad Dog was a good guy, and in one match, and he literally just left the ring. And everybody's wondering what happened. He didn't like what the finish of the match was going to be, and he left. And so the referee counted him out, and then he lost. But he left. He told Vern, go, give him the finger, and left. Well, he was just a tough guy to work with. And but one of his claims to fame is that aside from being so tough to work with, and I say claims to fame because this is sad. He was so tough on promoters and stiffing them all. Sometimes he'd sign for a match, they'd agree on what they were going to pay him, and then the night of the card, he'd come in and say, okay, I'm not going on unless I get this or get that. And that's not the way the business could be run. And he'd say, then I'm leaving. And then you got an arena full of 15, 20,000 people, and the guy's, your main event is going to leave, So he was tough. Well, he ended up doing that, as the story goes, a couple times down in Puerto Rico. And one of the promoters down there called him into I think I explained to you guys one time that the boardroom or the office for the guys when they were on the road was into the shower in the locker room. They'd have their little meetings where they'd talk in the shower. The shower wasn't on, but they'd have a meeting. Well, he got called into the locker or to the shower, and he was stabbed. Whatever the confrontation was, there's a lot of people that don't know what happened. He was stabbed, he was hauled out, and he died. And the wrestler that did it was acquitted. There were wrestlers that were there that wouldn't come forward and talk if they saw anything. And I could name the wrestlers, but they probably wouldn't mean anything to you. So he died a very sad, violent death. But most of the guys, and I think this is kind of hard, but most of them said, you know, he kind of got what he deserved, but yet nobody deserves that. So that's Bruiser Brody. Sheik Adnan El Casey. Now this is a true story in the background. His real name, as you see here, Adnan El Casey. It actually, the real name is Adnan El with an A, and then the K is right next to the L, a capital K, and it's not Y, it's I-E. That's his real name, Adnan El Casey. And he really was from Iraq. He represented the Olympics. He was an Olympian wrestler. He actually knew Saddam Hussein. Okay? And he has a book. There was a book written on him. It tells a lot of stories about the time over in Iraq. He came to the United States in 1960 to wrestle with an amateur background, and he wrestled as Adnan Casey. Not El Casey, just Adnan Casey. He was a babyface. But after a short time, Adnan Casey just kind of faded away. And then there was a guy on the cards that showed up, on the wrestling cards, a Native American, an Indian wrestler, Billy White Wolf. Guess what, kids? That was him. Full headdress, all the regalia. He was Billy White Wolf. He was a good guy, he wrestled all over, did good for many years in a lot of territories. And he wrestled out on the East Coast, Billy White Wolf. Well, in it was either late 79, early 80, all of a sudden we've got the Sheik here. Sheik Adnan El Casey. And he's dressed like this, and he's here to take the title back to Iraq. It was perfect at the time because if you remember back in the early 80s, we had a lot of the issues going on with Iraq and Iran, and you know, again, it was that ethnic, let's play the angle. But he was so good as a heel, so good and so hated. And no matter what he did, he's gonna win all the titles, and I'm gonna go to Iraq and nobody's gonna get him. So obviously you gotta beat this guy, you know. And then he started managing while he was wrestling, and he ended up teaming up with Jerry Blackwell, and he dubbed Jerry Blackwell Sheik Jerry Ayatollah Blackwell. and Jerry Blackwell was in this. Now we're going to talk about Jerry in a minute. But as a villain, as a heel, he was over like you wouldn't believe. And Vern loved him. And he was a nice guy outside the ring. So absolutely one of the good draws. Jerry Blackwell. Now here's a story of a guy who had wrestled for about 6 or 7 years as Jerry Blackwell. He wasn't doing that good. And the thing about Jerry Blackwell is you look at him, isn't that the epitome of the body everybody wants? Jerry, by all accounts, I mean, legitimately, he was always billed about 400 pounds. Legitimately, he might have been. He wasn't a wrestler. He was a brawler. But the things that man could do for the girth that he had, he is amazing. He moved, and he could take the bumps. Vern Gagne brought him in, and his intention was, because of his size, Vern wanted him to be, and he actually billed him as Farmer Blackwell. He wanted to make him he was from Georgia. So Vern's intention was going to make a good old Georgia country boy, and he was going to be a good guy. And he did this for a few matches. Well, the fans wouldn't accept him as a good guy. They were booing him. So naturally, goodbye Farmer with no mention. All of a sudden, he's Jerry Crusher Blackwell. Now, you know what happens now. Crusher says, wait a minute here. There's only one Crusher here. So they had to have a Crusher battle. And Crusher was nearing the end of his career at this time, but again, it was a perfect feud. Jerry Blackwell was so over. The guy, I swear to you, you know what a drop kick is, okay? Jerry Blackwell could do a standing drop kick and go down to the mat at his size. And it was incredible. And he could take the slams Just a great heel. And the fact that Vern brought him in as a babyface and they wouldn't buy it, we go to 1984, he'd been with the Sheik, and Brody was in the Sheik's army as well. It was called an army. And Blackwell and Brody and Sheik had some falling out in the ring. And before you know it, them, along with Abdullah the Butcher, were pounding on Jerry Blackwell. And they were beating on him, and they were beating on him. And there's one, this is at the St. Paul Civic Center, June in 1984. And I'm not lying to you, 20 minutes after the match was over, they're pounding on him. They were relentless. They will not stop. And 20,000 people are yelling, Jerry, Jerry, Jerry. And Dusty Rhodes, Kurt Hennig, Greg Gagne, a bunch of the fabulous ones, if you remember those, they were all in. Those were the good guys coming to Jerry's rescue. He turned into one of our best baby faces. The fans loved him because the other guys turned out. So Vern got his wish at the end. And then sadly, Jerry left us early. He had very bad diabetes. He didn't take care of himself. And he passed away. I think he was only in his 50s, early 50s, I think, if I recall correctly. But for all practical purposes, a good guy. Was that the last one? Was it? Well, now see, I want to point out that it's quarter after, and we started at quarter after, so am I good on time limits? All right, gang, here's the deal. At the beginning, I told you if you are interested in this, seriously, this is a fabulous book, okay? I am amazed at it, and I did have something to do with it. I don't take credit for all of the book, of course, but this is the prize. So you have to work it out here. If you are a member, Brent will be able to verify it. Your name should be in the jar. And if you want to get the book and you're not a member, or you want to be eligible to win the book, the only thing is you do have to